Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Red Bull have finally given some clarity on the Max Verstappen to Mercedes rumours as Helmut Marko has officially taken the reins in terms of speaking to the media since Christian Horner's departure, now giving more detail and clarity on that situation, but also heavily implying that the Max Verstappen meeting with Toto Wolff in Sardinia rumours that happened a few days ago may indeed have had some serious bout of reality within it. And if that is true, did they sign anything or at least have a detailed conversation? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. We're not going to talk any more about this on the left-hand side. We're going to talk instead about the driver market. Franco Colapinto may be at some degree of risk. There's been a big theory over the last couple of weeks. There was even some suggesting that Silverstone might be Colapinto's final race with Alpine. Riccardo Patrese says, former F1 driver, anything can happen with Briatore. From my point of view, Briatore is like a bomb that can explode at any minute. Colapinto in this moment is not safe, and I would not necessarily disagree with that assessment. So it's going to be an important few weeks, especially as rumours will continue to swirl around Bottas and Cadillac, and also around Alpine. And especially because Alpine may be a rather attractive prospect next season. They're going to have Mercedes power. There is a feeling that Mercedes are probably going to be the team to be at in that sense next year. Maybe, of course, could well still be McLaren. But I think that Williams and Alpine would expect an improvement in their competitiveness. So I think with respect to where Alpine currently are in the championship, which is last, despite having 19 points more than any other team that's ever been last in the championship, they're still last, and they will hope to improve drastically, and Briatore will, intend to make decisions, continue to make decisions that will help in that aim. Has that really happened? Maybe not so far. Now, loads of drivers are being linked to Cadillac, as we know. They put out a bit of a list as well. We'll talk about that here in a second. Pato O'Ward has been talked about, IndyCar driver for McLaren. Had a couple of good opportunities to win the 500 over the last couple of seasons, but, well, he says the rumours about me going to Cadillac were like the rumours that Alonso was hanging out with Taylor Swift. So that never seemed to happen. Now, there are plenty of names in that conversation. There are a few names that Cadillac themselves and their top guy actually mentioned, and these are some of the names here. Schumacher, Bottas, of course, confirmed they're talking with Perez. There's some interest in Tsunoda, potentially Felipe Drugovich, Fred Vesti, the list goes on. Even mentioned Lindblad, who we think is going to get a Red Bull drive. And there's also a general feeling that they would like to have an American driver at some point. Colton Herta, though, probably not the right fit for the time being. And maybe a driver from the Americas, as in, for Mexico, might well help them. So Mick Schumacher's in negotiations. He says, they're pushing for an agreement. It's a tough choice. Jack Doohan apparently has reached out. There were some rumours the other day that might have some validity as well, but Cadillac have to decide. They will clearly sign an experienced driver. Whether that's Perez, whether that's Bottas, whether that's somebody else, we'll see. The question then becomes, okay, do you go for somebody more experienced alongside them? Do you go for somebody else? The experience makes some degree of sense. I would say that the more rookie or let's say more raw talent approach makes a bit more sense if it's an American driver, because that's kind of what they would like to have long term. But right now that doesn't seem like what they're going to do. So it just makes it a little bit less feasible for me that someone like a Mick Schumacher or maybe a Jack Doohan are actually going to get that drive. But there are plenty of options on the table that Cadillac have to consider right now. However, Aston Martin say they are very much committed to their drivers. Now, Andy Cowell, former Mercedes head of their high-performance powertrains division when they were dominating the absolute universe, he's now team principal over there at Aston Martin, and he says that Alonso and Stroll both have drivers, or both have contracts for their drivers through 2026 and probably beyond. Stroll is just on a permanent 1+1 that just keeps getting extended forever, and Alonso we know is going to be driving there in 26 as well. The question, of course, is could this change? I think for now, the only thing that could change this dynamic is the introduction of Max Verstappen into the market. If he goes to Mercedes, or if Mercedes don't want him, might he choose to go to Aston instead? I actually really doubt that. I think there is a lot of concern, and maybe not even concern, but there are certainly questions over the Honda engine. How good it's actually going to be in 2026, because, lots of the Honda people, Horner ended up hiring for Red Bull powertrains, and, there was a feeling that maybe Honda aren't doing the same job in 2026 as they currently are, or at least towards the end of this era of regulations on the engine side where Honda turned it around after the disaster of the McLaren partnership. but only really Max being available, or if Max joins Mercedes, then Russell being available potentially. That maybe could sway Aston's minds. But, with teams as ambitious as Aston Martin, I don't think you can take anything for granted when it comes to what they say publicly. Even such as this, Andy Cowell also said that their Honda engine for 2026, is very much fitting hand in glove with the back of our monocoque and the front of our transmission. So, look, that's what he says. Andy Cowell knows a thing or two about building an absolutely dominant powertrain. So maybe the Honda engine is going to be really impressive. But there was a rumour a few months ago that Honda were kind of behind where they wanted to be. And we've not heard anything really on that for months. So it's tough to argue where Honda are right now. But it will be critical, right? Because there's nobody denying that Aston Martin could be a serious threat with Adrian Newey and the potential aerodynamic car that they might put together from that perspective. But it really is going to come down to if that engine's going to be any good or not. Andy Cowell is, of course, speaking a good game. And, this is the thing in Formula One. You tend to get certain teams that really like to talk a very strong and powerful game. Other teams that are less keen to do so. We know that Ferrari historically, it's hopium all the way. Next year's our year and all this. Maybe Aston Martin are going to be that team nowadays. Time will tell. This I thought was quite, I wouldn't say ambitious, but definitely kind of feisty from Lawson, right? Now, I don't blame him at all necessarily, especially because over the last couple of rounds, he's actually started to come good just a little bit, has improved a little bit anyway over the last couple of rounds. And he was asked the question, should he have been given more time? And he says, yeah, I should have been given 6 months in the RB21. I needed time and I wasn't given it. And yeah, that's very much true. Maybe Lawson feels that he can say this now that Horner's been fired. I don't know what you guys think about that, because I'm sure Horner was to some degree behind the decision, as maybe I'm sure was Helmut Marko. Helmut Marko said that his mechanics and engineers had told him that Lawson was mentally compromised and he was never going to get on top of this car. You've just got to get rid of him now. And that's what they decided to do. There was pressure from Honda to put Yuki in the car. That's what they did. Has it really worked out? No. And Lawson, seeing what Yuki's done, which is not much better at all than what he did, is probably thinking, maybe it's about time that I give a little bit of stick back to the main Red Bull team. But it is interesting, right, to see that Lawson is very much, let's say being pretty combative with the decision that Red Bull Racing made to demote him, or maybe promote him, whatever you want to say, back down to the Racing Bulls team, and saying that he should have been given 6 months. I don't necessarily disagree. Did they make the wrong decision putting Lawson in the car? Not necessarily, but I think that I would have put Yuki in the car at the start of the season. Given that Lawson was in the car, maybe they should have just kept him, right? Because also they put Yuki massively on the back foot because he didn't get the preparation time either that Lawson would have had at the start of the season in Bahrain testing and other such facilities. Over the last few days, there's been a theory and a rumour about what the 2026 cars are going to look like, what the actual regulations are, because we've talked about them being still ground effect, but far less ground effect than we currently have. This is, as QVIS Designs puts together, the floors from 2020 versus 2025, as in this year, versus 2026. So the previous generation floors looked like, as you can see on the far left-hand side, flat floors with, look, the floors are always going to generate some degree of downforce. It's just the way that they are designed, and the ground effect is a thing regardless of the Venturi tunnels you put on the car. But what you can quite clearly tell is the outlier in these three images is the middle one, right? Like these Venturi tunnels that are used to generate the bulk of the downforce that the floor generates are not existing on the newer version in 2026. Now look, does 2026 have a more complicated floor than 2020 did? Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot going on in 26, but there are clearly not, the Venturi tunnels that we have previously seen, and it's largely a flat floor design. Does that open the opportunity for the, let's say, rake that Red Bull likes to run to return? Possibly. I wouldn't say that's completely impossible. This is also another, I think, very valuable side-by-side. So again, 2020 versus 2025 versus 2026. And you can just see in 2025, right, like the depth of these tunnels and channels really is, I guess, what you should be calling them, that the airflow goes through, compared then to, the 2026 stuff or even the 2020 stuff where yeah, there's little elements on the front, and in 2026's case, actually plenty of elements, but it doesn't feed into a Venturi channel in the same way that it previously did. And then a look at the rear, so this is the 2020, I guess, now on the right-hand side, 2025 in the middle, and then 2026 on the left-hand side. So you guys can see that, the diffuser, again, is changing a lot. Now, look, sure, are there aerodynamic parts everywhere you'll find? Yes, it's a Formula 1 car, of course there are, but it's substantially different, and probably even more substantially different than people theorize, because I think when there was talk about moving away from the ground effect to a great degree, it was kind of thinking, okay, well, maybe it's still going to be the tunnels or the Venturi stuff that we're used to, but just to a lesser extent. But it's basically gone, and the floor's going to generate downforce, of course, but in a very different way to how it does today. Now, Ferrari have been struggling. There was even a talk that their issue with an understeer that they find in qualifying has persisted now for years, and that actually happens in 2022. They introduced an upgrade in Silverstone in France, and it led them down a path which they have not been able to recover from, which is quite a lot about Ferrari, doesn't it, really? That they started strong in 2022, then things started to fall apart for various reasons, and then they brought some upgrades that didn't really work, and here we are a couple of years later, despite apparently changing 99% of their car going into this year, and they are still suffering with a relatively similar issue. But Toto says, Fred, just let him cook, right? Let him cook, give him some time. Fred needs the trust to be able to manage this team, is what Toto Wolff has to say over the last few days. But what I wanted to talk about is what's been going on at Red Bull Racing, right? So over the last couple of weeks, there's been loads of rumours and increasing rumours around Max to Mercedes. Yes, Horner has left. Yes, the Verstappens may well have had something to do with that. But we know, and they have made this very clear, and Eric Van Haren and others have made this very clear, that does not guarantee by any means that Max is going to be staying at Red Bull next year. Now, there was a theory the other day, and we don't know if this is true, but there was plenty of evidence to suggest it, that Toto and Max had a brief meeting out in Sardinia. So, well, we'll actually have a look at that first before we look at some of these things. We can have a look at the following, which is Max's jet touching ground in Sardinia. He was there for about 5 hours before going home, and there was also tracking on Toto Wolff's yacht to suggest that he was in the same locality. There was also, because potentially Max landed his jet and then got on his yacht, I don't know, because his yacht was also in the same place, and there was this picture doing the rounds, and I am not going to pretend that I know if this is valid or not. I just thought it was kind of interesting. On the far left is supposedly Toto's yacht, and on the far right is supposedly Max's yacht. So, take it as you will, but apparently this was an image that was spotted to maybe imply that, yeah, there's something going on out there in Sardinia. So, is it just pure coincidence? Seems relatively unlikely that would be the case to me. So then we fast forward to the present day, and as a result of this supposed meeting in Sardinia, people are saying, well, is that a done deal then, right? Like Horner, this was shortly after Horner was fired. So many were suggesting, okay, they've met up to either sign something or get something penciled in, or really Toto just to understand what it means for Max now that Horner is gone. That's kind of what I think it was, if they were there at the same time as we think that they were. It's unlikely that Max was in town for 5 hours when Toto was clearly there just, on a whim, right? Like, it's pretty unlikely that he went to put his toes in the sand on the Sardinian beaches and fly home a couple of hours later. So, Zach Brown said something pretty interesting. Max in a Mercedes is pretty uncomfortable to think about because he's awesome. I think I'd rather he stay where he is, which is an interesting statement, really, because it's funny for Zach Brown. He doesn't want to take away too much credit from his competitor in Max Verstappen, because we know that, he made those comments last year and then Max made him pay for it, shall we say, after winning the World Championship. But also Mercedes are his engine supplier, so we can't really criticise them either. So what does he do? I guess his best bet is to say, well, Max should stay at Red Bull. That's the correct decision for all parties, and that would be better for them. Sure, because Mercedes could be very strong in 26. And do I disagree? I mean, no. If I was Zach Brown, you know that you have the measure of Max at Red Bull. I mean, that's how it is right now. Max is not able to compete with the McLarens, with the machinery that he currently has and the turmoil that team has experienced. So I don't blame Zach for suggesting, well, look, if he goes to Mercedes, that brings substantially more risks to the table. And with Christian Horner totally out of the picture, it's now left a lot of the discussion to Helmut Marko with what he wants to say to the media. We know that in so many times in recent years, Horner will say one thing, Marko will say almost exactly the opposite. But there's no more Horner, so Marko gets to dictate the shot as he would so wish. And, well, Marko said quite a few things. But interestingly, far less than he usually says. So he was asked about whether he met up with Toto, right, in Sardinia, like did this meeting take place? And Marko says Max can meet with whoever he wants. So, that's pretty, I think, telling from Marko, right? Like, if Marko was going to deny it and say, no, that was purely a coincidence, which he would know, then he would say something else than this. Like, I think that's as close to an admission of it as you're going to get from Marko, right? When Marko's asked, did he meet Toto? And Marko says, Max can meet who he likes. It doesn't affect us. We have a contract for 2028. We have a valid contract, and we assume that Max will stay with us. Funny thing is, of course, if Max leaves, Marko just might go with him, and there was a big rumour that if Marko was to leave, then Max would go with him as well. So I think it's funny now that I don't want to say exactly the inmates are ruling the asylum, but, it feels like Marko can say whatever he wants to the media, but it could be a very different story behind the scenes. At least when Horner was there, you kind of knew where Horner stood because it was Christian Horner racing. Now it's very interesting with Marko because, he's still loyal, I'm sure, to the late Mateschitz, but he also seems pretty loyal to the Verstappens. So, the Red Bull dynamic has always been so fascinating behind the scenes, and that's not necessarily changed. The other thing that he had to say was about the Christian Horner sacking, and he was asked the question, did Max know about this? Did he know that it was coming? Was he involved in the decision making? Was maybe the implication there? And Marko says Max was informed. Now, when was he informed is interesting. I'm presuming what he means is the decision was made by Red Bull management. Max was told about it before. Of course, the factory was told about it before we heard about it from home. Does that mean that Max was involved in the process of getting him fired? Not necessarily, but I think it's very likely that Max and certainly Max's camp and Jos Verstappen were involved in that discussion in recent weeks. And it's just very rare that you can get Helmut Marko to shut up, right? Like, it's a challenge to get Marko to stop talking to the media usually. He usually will say whatever he wants, even if Christian Horner then has to come out and say, well, Helmut did say that, but actually no this, or whatever, right? It happens so many times. Marko usually you can't stop him talking. It's just what he loves to do. Even if the Red Bull PR girl or whoever in charge over there is like, please, Helmut, stop. Like, we can't take it up for all these damn interviews. Now Marko doesn't want to speak. He's like, Max can speak to who he likes. I don't want to say more on that. Yeah, Max is informed about Horner. Don't want to say more on that. Like, surely that's got to be a little bit telling, hasn't it? That even you can't get Helmut Marko to talk to the press about this type of stuff right now. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Couple of interesting things to mention. Q3 appearances this year are as follows. Maybe what's a little more interesting is the qualifying championship, which is pretty interesting. So this is what the qualifying championship looks like. And all the way down to, there's a few guys at 0 points. Hulkenberg is at 0. Bortoleto actually has 4 points, Behrman with 5. So I'm just giving out points in the normal way, but based on qualifying results. Piastri is leading the qualifying championship by quite some way. It's actually Verstappen seconds in the qualifying championship, Norris down in third after some more challenging times. Russell a comfortable fourth in that Mercedes. Antonelli 7th. Sainz is actually in 8th. It's interesting how Sainz actually has more points on this championship than Albon does. But in terms of race execution and a bit of bad luck in there for sure, that's been a different story in the Grand Prix. So very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. And just one final thing. This is just a little updated weather forecast then for the weekend. We know that Spa, it's had its moments, hasn't it? Right? As Grand Prix over the last few years. And we're a little concerned about what rain all weekend might mean for the conditions out there. It would be great to see a wet weather race in Spa that actually runs, but we know the weather can be, let's just say, intermittent. Now, FP1, these are the numbers in terms of degrees, so it's relatively cool. Mercedes will probably be rather happy about it. Mercedes obviously have upgrades on the way potentially as well. So, I think they'll be looking at these temperatures and saying, okay, this looks pretty good, especially if it stays dry. But there's a pretty good chance that it's not going to stay dry. And 40% chance, 35% chance, 50% chance. So it feels like in at least, one of those sessions, we're going to have some sort of, some sort of weather. And there is a sprint this weekend. Let's not forget either. So very much interested to your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.